I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard, and you're watching The Pipeline. Today is February 1st, 2022. I'm joined as usual by the Western Standard's opinion editor, Nigel Hannaford. How are you, Nigel?
Great today. Nice to see you.
Excellent. And at long last, we're rejoined by our long lost child of the Standard, Cory Morgan, back up from the south. Got a little tan.
Maybe a little bit. I've come out of the desert. It was sunny but cold.
Yeah, it's tough to get a tan in the bar, isn't it?
Cory has been down south, sitting in a desert, smoking peyote or something. No, it's BC. It's
Going Vision Quest. Yeah.
On a Vision Quest, yeah. Speaking of Cory, I was shocked the other day. I was just, wasting time on Facebook, and I saw Cory published a book. I'm like, oh, I thought his publisher would know if he published a book. Apparently not. He didn't. Nonetheless, he was kind enough to bring in a copy for some of the staff, including myself today, the Sovereigntist's Handbook. It looked very familiar to me because if you recognize kind of the art on the front, that's also the Western Standard's cartoon columnist, Lyle Cron. It looked very familiar, and Cory gave me a copy this morning. I've been very busy today. I don't know how. I already found time to read 45 pages of his book. It's called the Sovereigntist's Handbook.
It is.
Take 10 seconds. Tell us about it.
I'm just, as an independence advocate for a long time, I just wanted to share some of the many mistakes I'd made so that people will stop repeating those mistakes today, because our independence advocates are very dedicated, but sometimes just need some guidance. They need a handbook, and that's what I put together.
How's it worked so far? So might be a good idea for someone to give it a read if you're interested in that. Okay, well, we got a good show today. Speaking of Cory smoking peyote in the desert, BC has decriminalized pretty much all hard drugs, opioids, methamphetamines, cocaine, crack, lots of fun stuff, and it'll be decriminalized as part of a pilot project cooperation with the federal government, exempting essentially the criminal code from BC until 2026. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion on that here. We probably don't even all agree on that one. This is one of those ones that kind of divides libertarians and conservatives a bit, where we might agree less often than we do. We're going to talk about the Freedom Convoy. I know we've talked about it a lot, but it's been over a year now, not just since it started, but since the renamed War Measures Act, the Emergencies Act, was invoked to suspend the right of free assembly and giving the police extraordinary powers, seize people's bank accounts, things like that. We're going to talk about the Freedom Convoy a year in the rearview mirror. What did it achieve? What were the lasting effects of it? Now we've got a year behind us. I think we've got a reasonably good idea. And we're also going to talk about some really fascinating new polls that are out. Not particularly good news for Justin Trudeau. Looks like the shine is off. Liberal support down significantly, approval and positive impressions of Trudeau way down. There's some very interesting numbers, and we're going to dive into them. The regional breakdowns, demographic breakdowns, how it works for Pierre Poilievre, for Jagmeet Singh. Very interesting stuff. Before we get going, though, we got to thank my favorite sponsor, the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Canadian Shooting Sports Association is Canada's leading firearms rights group in Canada. I've trusted them with my membership dues for over a decade, because without these guys, our firearms would have been seized long, long ago. These guys are on the front lines, advocating to politicians, helping them to understand as much as they're capable, we hope, about reasonable firearms legislation and regulation, advocating, working on public education, making sure the public understands. You got to remember, most people who don't own firearms don't necessarily like firearms. Some just think it's kind of weird. I don't know. I don't own planes. I think guys who own planes are kind of weird. I don't try to take away their aircraft, but I think it's kind of weird dudes who own planes.
I actually had a Cessna 172 for several years.
You're a weird guy. Well, you're a weird guy.
It's only the accent.
No, it's more. It's more. Now you're kind of a James Bond character to me. Okay.
You're too kind.
But it's important. So if you're not yet a member of the CSSA, go to cssa-cila.com, org, or just do what I do and Google it and join them today. It's worth every penny. You should become a member yesterday. Okay, so let's start with our first story, BC decriminalizing hard drugs. So this has been coming for some time, but it just came into effect, I think, yesterday, that pretty much all hard drugs in BC up to 2.5 grams for personal use are now decriminalized. Now, that doesn't mean legal. You can't, go to your local Calgary weed store equivalent in BC and, get a little bag of crack. Can't do that. It means you're still going to be obtaining it through illegal means, but you're found by the police with something really bad like meth, heroin, or something maybe less bad, mushrooms and different things like that. They're not gonna confiscate it from you, and you're not going to be charged as criminal. This is going to be in place until the end of January 2026. Now, this has got a few angles to it. There is some defensible, even for those people who are definitely not fans of drugs, it's defensible. 2,236 people died of illicit drug use in BC alone last year. And that's pretty much mostly just overdoses. That's a wild number of people. And roughly to our population, Alberta is in a similar number. Saskatchewan is a similar number relative to our populations. Tons of people are dying from this. We've got addicts. We've had 60 years of the war on drugs, roughly, in different forms, and there's no end in sight. It's not been working. But is this really the answer? Now, the federal minister responsible for this, Carolyn Bennett, said, I thought this was interesting. She says, this will reduce the stigma and harm of drugs. I can get the harm reduction part, but I have a hard time swallowing how it's good to destigmatize something that is bad. The federal government actively tries to attach a stigma to tobacco smoking, and that's probably a good idea. It's not a good thing to do, but it's active government policy to attach a stigma to it. They even try to stigmatize drinking more than 2 light beers a week, but they want to destigmatize crack and heroin and methamphetamines. So there's a lot to unpackage here. Start with you, Nigel. Do you think they're getting this right? Is this move that's going to, by decriminalizing it, not treating users as criminals, still going after dealers ostensibly? Probably hard to get to dealers if you can't arrest the users. Leverage them to squeal on the dealer. But do you think this is going to actually have a positive outcome for? I guess there's a few ways to look at it. There's we always would talk about the kid who got caught with a joint in high school, his life's ruined. Well, that's obviously not happening anymore. That's probably a good thing. But I don't know. Net positive, is BC onto something here, or are they just kind of going into almost dystopian future?
Well, Derek, there's a couple of, as you say, there's more than one angle to this. Don't have a crystal ball, so can't say whether this is going to reduce deaths in 2023. We would always hope that, whether we think they're right or wrong in doing this. Obviously, we don't want to see people dying of drugs. But one of the things about, one of the functions of government is to signal what is right behavior. Now, obviously, all the obvious things, theft, murder, that's understood. But when you come to some of these other issues, what is right? When I was growing up, when I was learning to drive, motor cars did not have seatbelts. Over the course of the last 60 years, designs have changed, cars have seatbelts, and now, notwithstanding the libertarian argument that people shouldn't be forced to wear seatbelts if they don't want to, you will get fined if you...
I know it's a boogeyman argument, but I do agree. I don't think it should be mandatory.
Well, maybe I agree with you on that. But what I'm saying is that the government had made that decision that it would say the right thing to do is to wear a seatbelt in your car and a helmet if you're riding a motorbike. And people eventually got used to the idea, and now you wouldn't get an awful lot of argument about it.
How's that working for drugs?
Well, what the link with drugs here is that if they say there's no stigma, if they say it's okay to have a small amount, initially some people, like myself, will say, no, that's the wrong direction to take. Either you're into helping people get off drugs, or you're facilitating a bad habit that's going to kill them. But if I lose the argument today, in 5 years' time, it'll probably be renewed. And in 10 years' time, there won't be too many people who agree with me on that. There are right now. So government is sending the wrong signal. Now, contrast that with Alberta. We have, as you say, similar problems. But interestingly, our numbers are going down more significantly than British Columbia's. And our approach is not to make it easier for people to have drugs. This government has decided that they're going to try and, if anybody wants to get off drugs, they'll help them. So they've built treatment beds and they've got various programs in place to help people. And I would link those kinds of measures that have now been going on for a couple of years. Remember Jason Kenney, whatever else you say about Jason Kenney, that was one of his big things in 2019.
But those are not mutually contradictory policies necessarily.
They
helping people get off.
They don't have to be, but I don't hear anything from BC about, look what we're doing to help people get off. All I hear about is safe injection sites. Roll in here with your drug and we'll give you a clean syringe. That's not helping. And this isn't helping either.
Okay, but we have been more or less taking, with different flavors and variations, the approach of prohibition and war on drugs forever. Really, as soon as narcotics, as we know them, at least modern narcotics as we know them, have been around, they've been prohibited. And that ramped up in the 60s, and then Nixon declared war on drugs in the early 70s. We've been doing that for a long time. I feel like if that was ever going to work, it would have worked somewhere in the world by now. And prohibition seems to never work if people want to do it. And it didn't work for alcohol, and alcohol isn't nearly as addicting as opioids and methamphetamines and things like that. I don't know, Cory, do you have a different take, or are you with Nigel on this? Is BC's approach might be, I think, a little open. I'm a bit iffy on injection clinics and things like that, but I don't see anything contradictory between helping people get off drugs, making sure that we've got appropriate programs in place, and just not necessarily treating them as criminals for small possession.
Yeah, well, these aren't mutually exclusive, but part of the problem is the ideology has made it that way. And we've got two very stark examples, actually. Portland's already gone down this road. They did the free-for-all. They did the will destigmatize. And I had one of their members of their legislature on the show. Their overdoses exploded dramatically. And Vancouver's are rising as well. Alberta's taken a treatment-focused thing. They've 8,000 treatment beds. It's more than double BC's amount, even though we have a smaller population, and we're having a reduction in overdoses. Now, people point to Portugal, though, and it's always been a good example. But Portugal didn't just open it up in decriminalization. They had a very intensive treatment-focused policy to go with it.
They outright legalized, didn't they?
Yeah, I believe so. Because there's no sense chasing an addict around because he's got a dime bag of some sort of poison on him. But at the same time, there's different attitudes of that. What we're seeing from Portland and BC is almost implying that you could sustain a lifestyle while continuing to consume. Look, there's no lifestyle you can maintain when you're on meth or when you're on heroin or some of those strong drugs. I mean, it's a complicated area, but it just seems to be either or. It's like in BC, it's all about safe consumption and enabling and providing clean drugs. Whereas perhaps Alberta is turning away a bit from the safe. You can't treat them if they're dead. So, I mean, if you can keep them consuming safely for a while till you can get them into treatment, we need both. And I think Portland has kind of found, or not Portland, Portugal has sort of found that combination. There's no sense wasting police resources. As you say, prohibition fails. But also, they're not saying you should carry on with it. They're saying, we want you off this crap, and we're going to give you all the resources we can to get you off this crap. We're just not going to throw you in jail for it.
It's, Carolyn Bennett, she kind of taking her broadly for that movement. I think she was speaking for many supporters of that policy when she talked about reducing the stigma. And for me, that seemed, I'm very open to this kind of thing. I don't think people should be criminalized for doing something that doesn't hurt anybody else. Although, certainly if you're on meth or crack, you're almost certainly going to hurt someone else. But there's other drugs in here where people do consume and it's just recreational. They're not hurting others. But I'm pretty open to this. But then when she talks about destigmatizing, I scratch my head wondering, are they giving then a moral sanction to this? That this is, at the end of the press conference, they said, and just to be clear, we're not encouraging people to do drugs. And I thought, isn't it something that they needed to add that in at the end? Because it wasn't very clear. I know that they're not sitting there saying, we're making crack legal because we want everyone to do crack. They don't. I don't believe that. But, I think it's one thing for government to require someone to do something. I don't think government should require someone to wear a helmet on a motorcycle. But I definitely think government should play a role in creating a stigma against idiots who don't. I mean, that's a role. That's the educative role of government. I don't think you should be forced by law to wear a seatbelt. Definitely think the government should drive through people's minds that it's a very good idea to wear a seatbelt. Justice, I don't think we should be throwing people in jail for small possession of narcotics. But I think it's a very weird thing for the government to say, we're not going to judge here. There's nothing necessarily wrong with doing these drugs. Because, some of them, mushrooms, arguably cocaine. There's people who can live their lives doing that. But has anyone ever met, other than the mayor of Toronto, a functional crackhead? I haven't. They pretty much don't exist. And it hurts other people when they do it.
Well, you opened this discussion, Derek, by pointing to the things that they stigmatize and contrasting it with the drugs, which they now want to destigmatize. This is the logical inconsistency that you find so often when you examine the policies of this Liberal government. And it's just that they have a very, very different worldview where some things are okay and other things aren't. I just think we have a very different idea of what's okay. And my point on this is simply that it's not okay to be on drugs. I mean, maybe we're not going to chase you down the road. Maybe we're not going to put you in jail. But boy, we don't want to see you stay there.
Yeah.
If we can get you off drugs, then we should. And you should want to. There is a stigma.
Well, let's talk about... I'm not sure how good a segue this is. Sort of a stigma. The after effect of the Freedom Convoy. So it's been more than a year now since Justin Trudeau and his government invoked the Emergencies Act, which was the reworked version of the War Measures Act, which the only time, it's funny, the only time the War Measures Act has ever been invoked in peacetime is when there's a guy named Trudeau in office. So it's been a year. They invoked this. They froze a bunch of people's bank accounts without any due process whatsoever. Sent in a bunch of goons to clear people out, beat up some old ladies with walkers on the streets in front of Parliament, and the Freedom Convoy comes to an end. We already know the story. And we know, there's the inquiry going on, but I want to talk big picture. Zoom out to 2 miles up. I want to talk about its lasting effects. What did it achieve? So we'll start with you, Cory. What, if anything, do you think the Freedom Convoy actually achieved? Because, in your book, you talk about some of the misguided folks in the convoy issued this so-called memorandum of understanding for the Governor General to fire the government and put the Senate in charge or something crazy. Yeah. Obviously, that didn't happen. Justin Trudeau is still the Prime Minister, but I don't know. What were the lasting effects you think came out of this?
I think a lasting effect, despite speaking of stigmatizing, the government worked very hard to try and make the picture that everybody who was in that convoy or everybody who supported it was on the fringe or they were crazy or they were extreme. And that wasn't the case. Yes, there were some people of questionable motive. When you get thousands of people, you always will. And they're usually the loudest ones too. But what I think was accomplished was, holy cow, those passive Canadians, eventually you can push them too far, or at least enough of them far enough that they're going to get up and push back. And the government panicked. It's a matter of opinion or whether they overreacted. I certainly feel, and I think most of us do feel they did. But I think the members of the government do understand there's a limit. They never saw a limit before. They had never seen a limit with Canadians and how far they could push them. This time they saw a line. They got way too close to it or they crossed it. And I think that is a positive development in the long run.
So your big takeaway was that kind of the liberal establishment of the government realized that it might be really far that you could push Canadians, but there is somewhere.
Yeah, and it won't turn them good or reasonable, but I think they did get a bit of a slap back and realize, they panicked. They got scared. Like, wow, okay, we pushed it too far. And it's good for every government, I think, to learn that now and then.
Nigel, what do you think what did it achieve? What were the big achievements of the convoy?
Well, first to Cory's point, it did everything that he said. The government got the message. The question now is, what is the government going to do with that message? Is it going to say, okay, fine, we hear you, we back off, we don't push the limits in, should a similar situation ever reoccur? Or do they say, well, if we're going to actually keep control of this crowd, here are the things we need to do while we got some time to get it set up. Let's take a look at the internet. How are people going to access the internet? What are we going to let them see? Are we going to have an active office policing disinformation and misinformation? Maybe we need to add hunting rifles to the list of banned firearms. We don't know how that's going to play out yet. It's been too soon. But I wouldn't assume that a government that thinks the way that this government thinks is necessarily going to consider itself reprimanded and change its ways. I do think that it's entirely possible that they will take notes about what they need to do next. And we shall see over the coming months and years. Probably not much before the next election, if indeed it goes out as far as 2025. But watch out after that.
Let's talk about the effect it had on politics and conservative politics in particular. It wasn't necessarily a right-wing movement, but it was dominated by people who tended to vote conservative or PPC. A lot of libertarians. It was born. The Freedom Convoy was hatched from Alberta. It was an Alberta movement that picked up steam everywhere. So I want to talk about the effect on conservative politics, and there's two very easy ones, I think, at least to see. The most immediate effect was the capitulation of Aaron O'Toole's leadership. It came to a very swift and bloody end very quickly. Aaron O'Toole came out and was very tepid about it. He knew that these people are supposed to be conservative voters, but maybe weren't. Maybe they had just voted PPC in the recent election, but they were on the right. But Aaron O'Toole was pretty left for a conservative, and wasn't very comfortable with it. And he had some wishy-washy statements. Behind the scenes, he had made some moves against perceived leadership rivals. Wink, wink. And it all and he made moves against them, and it all resulted in his quick capitulation as a leader with the Conservative caucus voting him out. Less directly, but I still think pretty connected, is accelerating the end of Jason Kenney's premiership. There was the Coutts blockade, which was pretty much a part of the same movement. Jason Kenney had gone around lying, saying that the protesters at Coutts had attacked RCMP officers. The RCMP confirmed on the record to us that was just not true. It was not based on anything. Jason Kenney just made it up. And a lot of these protesters, both in Ottawa and at Coutts, they were carrying signs that had Justin Trudeau and Jason Kenney on the same sign, putting them together as partners and lockdowns and mandates. So go to you first, Nigel, on how significant were the effects on conservative politics in Canada, and do you think much of that is going to be lasting?
I think it was very significant, and I think I can't tell you whether it's going to last 100 years, but I can tell you it's going to last to the next election. The whole thing was a reaction to some very specific COVID restrictions on cross-border trucks. That was the actual spark in the pan. But it came after a long period of people becoming increasingly disillusioned with the information that they were receiving from government and from public health authorities, because it often seemed contradictory and it often didn't seem to really reflect the truth.
Right.
So what it created was a huge atmosphere for somebody who would tell it as it was. And certain conservative politicians had a tendency to do that anyway, and presented authenticity. People had the impression that people like Pierre Poilievre, for example, were saying what they really thought and not what was a carefully crafted message. And that idea led, as we saw, to a massive win in the conservative leadership debate. And I think that Danielle Smith also put a very straightforward message out there, and people responded to it.
Mhm.
Couldn't have done that prior to COVID, prior to the convoy. Oh, well, they're just extreme, they're this, that, and the other thing. But people finally said, at last, somebody actually seems to get it. That's the effect that all this had on our politics.
Cory, what effect do you think it had on conservative politics in particular? Both personnel and maybe movements more broadly.
Yeah, well, I think it also isolated a dangerous split. I mean, as mentioned, when you have Jason Kenney and Trudeau on the same side, because the distrust of government is run so deep for some of them that just anybody who's in authority and in power, they're going to oppose. And that's led to a lot of problems too. I mean, we've got prickly conservatives who love to fight with each other within their parties at the best of times. And this has given a very big flashpoint for a very vocal group within them that just want no more restrictions, no more coming down, and other ones who worry about being painted with the extreme end. And it's a tough tightrope. It put them in difficult positions as leaders. And it's going to take a while to get through that. As Nigel said, that's going to carry over into the next election. You know that's what's going to be brought up, and the Conservatives are going to have to learn how to deal with that.
All right. While speaking of the next election, we've got some very interesting polls out. So Abacus Research put out some polls, I think just today. And the news is not particularly good for Justin Trudeau. It's not. He's not certainly doomed. They always say the only poll that matters is the poll on election day. Well, everyone says that when it's not a good poll, but nonetheless, polls are a snapshot in time. And if you have polls over a period of times, they might show trends. They can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow, but they can tell you what's happening today and yesterday. So we're going to start with kind of the broad feelings. It's not just who are you going to vote for. We're going to finish with who you're going to vote for and dig into those. But there's a lot of inputs to go into how someone votes. So, they asked Canadians, it's weighted in different provinces and demographically and whatnot. They asked if they believe Canada was going on the right direction or was on the wrong track. And that's generally a good indication of how well a government is doing in public perception. 30% of Canadians polled said that Canada was moving in the right direction. 55 said it was on the wrong track. Now, I know those numbers don't match. There are some people who don't know or are unsure. But 55 on the wrong track, 30% on the right track. Now, we've also got figures showing how that's moving over time. In June of 2021, 47% of Canadians said Canada is going in the right direction. 47% in just June 2021. Different world. June 2021, 47. Today, 30. Those who think, Now we've got how people believe that are the Liberals paying attention to the right issues? Again, these are kind of input issues that will eventually filter down into how people may vote at election time. Is the Liberal government paying enough attention to these issues? The rising cost of living. 72% say the government is not focused enough. Only 4% say too focused, and 18% say focused as much as they should be. So Canadians, huge numbers on across the political divides, even the slight majority of Liberals saying they're not focused enough on cost of living. Very similar numbers for the cost of housing. Problems with the healthcare system, 66% say not enough, 5% too much, 21% the right amount. Growing the economy, 52% say not enough, 27% approving of how much. And it kind of goes down the list from there. This is interesting, actually. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 23% say focused too much, 17% not focused enough, and 46% focuses as much as they should be. So that's actually where the big one, but it's a fairly large, sizable minority, 23% saying too focused. Similar with Indigenous, let's talk about racism. Reducing racism and inequality. 30% say not enough. I think they mean that Justin Trudeau needs to wear blackface every day to question period. But 20% saying the government's just spending too much time on it. And this kind of boils down to impressions of Justin Trudeau. And this is where there's really concerning numbers for him. In, say, May 2021, he had a net favorability impression of about -1 or 2, meaning, if you had 10% say, if 60% disapprove of you and 40% approve of you, you'd have a negative impression of 20. So he was only at -2% May 2021. It wasn't too popular then, but it was almost equal between how many people approved and disapproved. Today, the numbers in January 2023, 50% have a negative impression of him. 31 have a positive impression. Cory, not good trends for the Liberal government. They're not good trends for Justin Trudeau. But he's been down in the polls before and still secured re-election. Do you think, I don't know, do you think the shine is finally coming off of Justin Trudeau, or just another blip?
I like to think so, but as Justice Nigel kind of mentioned earlier, Trudeau can be underestimated, and it'd be a danger to do so. But I think with that broader trend, something we've seen that's happened, though there's always been issues, as sort of showed one of the polls, is people are feeling it in their wallets. It's one thing with a war in Ukraine. It's one thing with racial issues. For most people aren't dealing with it. But when suddenly you're not making the bills at the end of the month, or you're really feeling that crunch, you're cutting back on your vacations, you're worrying about where you're going to be, that affects everybody, liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter. And it brought it to your doorstep. And now they're paying attention. And this is where Justin Trudeau is going to have to show some strength. And he hasn't shown much strength in the economic front since he got in. So,
Nigel, how worried do you think Trudeau should be about this? It's they're not catastrophic numbers, but if you look at the numbers up on the screen, there's kind of a fork in the road now. The fork, the last time his favorables and unfavorables were at least equally matched was November 2021. Every single poll since then has showed favorables continuing to increase and unfavorables increasing and favorables decreasing, and an increasingly large departure between those numbers. Do you think he has any significant chance of trying to close that gap back down?
Yes, I do. And the reason that I say that he does, I'll come to in just a moment. But what you're witnessing there is the slow and steady loss of trust. First time somebody does something stupid, people laugh at them and mock them and condemn them, and then they forget about it. The second time that somebody does something stupid, they say, oh, wasn't he the guy who did such and such? When you get up to about the 10th or the 12th time, they've forgotten the individual incidents along the way. They just know they don't like the guy, that he's a fool. Now, with Mr. Trudeau, we have had a succession over 7 years of incidents that have caused people to lose their trust in him. And it has resulted in that spread that you're seeing on that graph there. That line is just showing how people are walking away. They've got less and less time for Mr. Trudeau. However, depend upon the Liberals, this is where they would pull it back. They will use a fear and smear campaign during the election when it comes. They will use arguments like, if you're a conservative, you're with all those racist, misogynist truckers. If you are a conservative, you are in the same camp as that crazy premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, who's out to wreck Confederation. It's all rubbish, but it plays well where the Liberals typically fish for votes. So that is going to be his salvation. And to the point that we were speaking of earlier today, it is common to write Mr. Trudeau off as a fool because he does many foolish things. Nevertheless, he is making the changes to Canada that he wants to make. We have so far not had the power to stop him. So maybe it isn't him who's the biggest fool.
We don't like to face that.
We don't, but we need to.
Well, let's talk about his partner in crime, Jagmeet Singh, and then his main opponent, Pierre Poilievre. So Jagmeet Singh has kind of got a reverse trend, as you're going to see up on the chart here. He began with pretty big net favorables. July of 2021, he had 38% approval, only a 26% disapproval. It's funny how Canadians give the Green and NDP leaders this weird thing. The Canadians, we're not going to vote for your parties, but we always like your leaders. It's a weird Canadian tradition. He got up to a really good positive gap by September 21, pretty much during the election. Didn't get him many seats. Again, Canadians like their lead, like the far left leaders, but don't vote for their parties generally. He had a 46% positive impression from Canadians, and only 25% negative. That's a big spread. So as Trudeau's began pretty much even between favorable and unfavorable, and split open with unfavorable at the top and favorable at the bottom, Jagmeet Singh's done the opposite. He had a big favorability and fairly low unfavorability, and they've closed in now, where for the first time in the history of polling around Jagmeet Singh by Abacus data here, his favorables and unfavorables are tied at 34% respectively. So a net favorability of 0. I guess we won't spend too much time on Singh, but we'll start with you, Nigel. What would be driving that? Because I don't think he's changed what he's doing that much. I guess in the last few days he started throwing shots at Trudeau, so maybe that's a sign that his very close collaboration with Trudeau is hurting his popularity.
Well, you're reading my mind. I mean, this is the thing. What's the point of Jagmeet Singh? What's the point of the NDP? They are there to prop up the government. That is the popular perception. You'll notice that when that very strong positive gap between favorable and unfavorable was when he was his own man. Once he did the deal with Mr. Trudeau to prop up somebody who has been decreasing in popularity as the months go by, other people are saying, well, you're actually part of the problem too, then, aren't you, Mr. Singh? If you're holding this man up, we don't like him. Maybe we don't like you either.
Remember, his supporters are more often than not further left than liberal supporters. So, Corey, why would people be? Is this just conservatives who maybe thought they liked him but wouldn't vote for him before, who are turning against him because he's propping up Trudeau, or I don't know? Are these new Democrats who are thinking? Believe it or not, there's always a lot of new Democrats out there who think that no matter how far left the Liberals go, the Liberals are really right-wing sellouts to business, etc. I don't know. Why do you think this is? Because this trend, it's been going on really since he's been on a downward trend since the election. It really accelerated though last summer to the point now where there is no gap. It's finally sealed. What do you think driving this?
And this trend, as you said, it's a trend about the person, not the polls in general. And I mean, people look at people like, as you said, the exception they make for NDP leaders and Green leaders, they're that voice of conscience from the left. They can speak as an opposition member to highlight issues or speak for the working man or for the environment. And they enjoy that. They know they're not going to get into power, but they can respect the person and like the person. But now, as you said, he's hitched his wagon to Trudeau, and that means you're going to ride the popularity with him, and he looks weak. For his own supporters who wanted him to stand out then and pull things farther left, they're going to start dropping off. I mean, if Poilievre had made a deal with Trudeau, as unimaginable as it sounds, conservatives wouldn't put up with it for terribly long. They're going to be pretty upset, saying there's some conservative things we want to see happening. We're just not going to stick with you any longer. I think it's Singh's own base that's starting to depart from him right now, saying, well, if I wanted to vote for Trudeau, I would have voted for Trudeau. You can't be in bed with him. I just can't support it.
Yeah.
So we're going to move over to Pierre Poilievre. So we've got numbers actually from O'Toole and Poilievre here from the same period, again, starting in September 2021 to present day, polling about every month along the way. Now, you can see the numbers at the end of O'Toole's time. They look a lot like Justin Trudeau's time right now. The last poll of O'Toole before he was decapitated as Conservative leader had him with only 20% of Canadians approving of him and 43% of Canadians disapproving, which means a lot of Conservatives were disapproving of O'Toole. That's when you're in real trouble, is when you are less popular than your party. Now, Polyev starts here in March 2022. There was a slight lead. There was 22% negative against him, 20% positive, which means that the clear majority of Canadians had no impression of him at all. He's fairly well known for an opposition leader, but I guess maybe not that well known. So what's happened between March and January of this year now is that the gap between his positive and negative hasn't really changed much. There's slightly more unfavorables than favorables against him here. But there's just a lot more people having both a favorable and unfavorable impression. So you'll see, it was 22 unfavorable at the beginning to 20 favorable, 2-point difference. Now there's 34% unfavorable and 31% favorable. So I guess it's increased by 1 percentage point within the margin of error. I don't know. Is this just people maybe just getting to know him a bit better, and on net people who there's just as big a proportion of people who didn't like him as before, and just as big a proportion of people who do like him as before. There's just more people who know of him. I don't know. What do you think?
I would make a bet that the people who like him are mostly conservatives, and the people who don't like him are mostly.
Well, that's a wild bet. I don't know if you should take that one.
This is a random poll, so I would. What I notice is that people who have strong opinions frighten Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
He has strong opinions. He is very articulate. Once you have had things explained to you by Mr. Poilievre, a lot of people don't know what to say, and they're not sure they agree, but they feel like they don't have an argument anymore. So what do? They just turn their back on him. I think Danielle Smith runs into some of that same problem. She wants to change things. She has very strong opinions. People don't necessarily disagree, but they just don't like the forcefulness of opinions. They're used to weak, pusillanimous leaders, and people with strong ideas frighten them. So I think there's a certain amount of that involved with Pierre's numbers.
Or I want to move on to voter intention, but we can wrap this stuff on Polyev into it, because I'm going to come to you first, Cory. So how would you vote? I was going to ask people, how would you vote if there was an election tomorrow? And, well, the Conservatives have been, there's been an upward trajectory for the Conservatives, down for the Liberals, down a bit for the NDP as well. Bloc is about steady. The PPC is really kind of dropped off. The PPC lost a lot of its raison d'etre when Polyev came in. It still got about 4% support, which is actually more than I would have thought. That is a stubborn voter base. If Polyev can take back, gets him a majority government probably. So Conservatives have been on an upward trajectory. They're now at 37% in the polls. That's up 3 from the latest, and Liberals are down 4. People's Party down only 1 from I think the election, where they got around 5%. Now it's always imperfect math. It drives me crazy when people say this. Well, if you take this party plus this party, you get this amount of votes. That is sometimes true, but it is more often than not entirely true. But if you got the PPC at 4, the Conservatives are now in minority government territory. 37%. They're going to get a clear plurality of seats. Now, are they going to get to be the government? That depends. The Liberals could stay in power if they can get the Bloc and the NDP to support them, and that could happen. So I'm generally of the theory that unless the Conservatives are just like 3 seats short of a majority, there's no such thing as a minority government. But these are pretty strong numbers for them. The PPC is stubbornly still at 4%. We'll start with you, Cory. What does Polyev need to do to try to get that 4% over? Because if he can get it, he is then in very clear, significant majority government territory.
Yeah, but I don't know what he could do to get them without bleeding some into that Liberal bunch that are in the center, because that's part of what he's got to harvest as well. Mm-hmm. He's in a really tough spot. And, I mean, the trends are favorable in the sense that they're not going down. They're slowly climbing up. It's a positive thing, but he needs a breakaway. He's got to pull away from there. I mean, we know as well they've won the popular vote repeatedly. that's where these polls get a little deceptive, but it doesn't necessarily translate into seats. They need to see a more comfortable number in there. And yeah, harvesting, that stubborn 4 to 5% from the PPC, I'm not sure. I'm kind of lost for words on how you would strategize to get them without perhaps shedding votes on the other side with it. It's a very tough dilemma, and that can be the number that makes a difference in a whole heck of a lot of tight races. I mean, that's a spoiler territory.
I think there was about 15 seats they figure that they lost because the PPC took up some of their vote.
Yeah, I mean, as Derek said, it's not necessarily a direct translation, but
No.
but if you can get, there's certainly those PPC voters are not typically going to go Liberal or NDP. So if you're going to get them chances, the ones with the better chance
They
of getting them.
disproportionately came from the Conservatives, but a surprisingly large minority of them were people who voted Green, NDP. Not too many Liberals, because Liberals are just such an establishment party. But, when there were naturopathic hippies on Vancouver Island who became PPC. People you really just wouldn't expect. And the media just had such a hard time wrapping their head around it. Even I had a hard time wrapping my head around some of them. But it depends where the votes are. So
Libertarians stick together,
Well,
said no one ever.
there are those left libertarians and right ones, and they love fighting with each other. But they're
Right libertarians can't even agree on what to do, let alone moving other ones. The regional breakdown's interesting. So in BC, the Liberals are running a increasingly distant third place at only 22%. You've got the Greens at 8%. I mean, definitely their best province. I think they have at least one seat, maybe two there. NDP second at 28%. Conservatives poised to make pretty big gains at 38%. Now, again, BC is a big province. The way that slices down in the seat-by-seat race is tough. Not surprising to people. Conservatives dominating in Alberta at 55%. The NDP in second at 21%, and the Liberals again at 14%. Those 14% are people who were did not live any portion of their life under the National Energy Program. Similar, almost mirror image Alberta to the combined Manitoba and Saskatchewan numbers. 53% Conservative, 15% Liberal, 23% NDP. Everywhere west of Ontario, it's Conservative dominant, and the only challenger is the NDP. The Liberals are not really a significant challenger outside of a few individual seat pockets. There are localized pockets where the Liberals can be competitive, but they have fallen out of contention west of the Lakehead. Ontario, the Conservatives slight lead over the Liberals, and then that's really where the election's going to be determined, 37 to 35. Quebec, Liberals in a statistical lead, 31% over the Bloc at 30, Conservatives at 22, and Liberals obviously leaning Atlantic, as they always do, 53 to 37. Nigel, what stands out? Anything interesting in the regional breakdowns for you?
Yeah, that Ontario number is, I think, an improvement for the Conservatives, because it seems to me that at the last election, we built up huge majorities in the Western provinces, and that's confirmed by this most recent poll. But the Conservatives lost a lot of seats in Ontario by not that much, which means
razor-thin margins. Yeah.
Which means that if there is any kind of an uptick in Ontario for the Conservatives, that's going to translate into actual seats. I mean, don't want to go back into too much past history, but it can get as close as 2 votes, which is what the Conservatives won an Ontario seat on the shore of Lake Huron in 2011. That's Nipissing, Timiskaming. Mm-hmm. After about 30 recounts, it was ours by 2 votes. So if you think of that, there were a lot of seats in that election that were. I did a spreadsheet on this, took the results, and I think that we had a majority of 16 at the time. So I took the 16 seats that we held by the smallest majorities, added up those majorities, and I don't think I got to 5,000 votes. Mm-hmm. So and that's largely in Ontario. So if
it's not how you vote, it's where you vote.
It's where you vote. Oh, so true. So very true. Yeah. That for the Conservatives, that's encouraging.
So the Liberals in the last 2 federal elections have had wickedly efficient vote. And by that, for those you aren't as familiar with this, you know, you only need to win one more vote than the next highest guy in a constituency to win the seat. So it doesn't matter if you had 10,000 more votes or one more vote, you win. And so if you're running up 10,000 vote majorities, although that doesn't happen federally, we don't have that many voters in the riding, but if you had 10,000 votes more than the next guy in the riding, you've wasted 9,999 votes. Those are wasted votes. And so the Liberals and Conservatives won some seats, particularly in the West and rural parts of Ontario, by huge margins, and then lost by the slimmest margins in all these 905 suburban Ontario, surrounding Toronto seats, that kind of stuff. The thing about having an efficient vote is it's efficient until it's not. And then it becomes hyper inefficient. The greatest example of all time were the Progressive Conservatives in 1993. Now, they were going to lose anyway. They were going to lose power. But they had this hyper efficient vote. And even though they placed second nationally, they placed fifth place in seats when it was done, because they had
two left.
They had two seats.
Waynes
And only one of them had been reelected. Jean Charest was the only one reelected. Elsie Wayne was new. So they won two seats nationally from a big majority government down to virtually nothing, less than the NDP, less than the Bloc, less than the Reform Party, obviously less than the Liberals, even though they were second place because their votes were just spread a little bit everywhere, and it got them nothing. Similarly, in Alberta, the Progressive Conservatives in 2015, they had slightly more of the vote than the Wild Rose, but the Wild Rose had twice as many votes, even though we were in opposition, because the PCs were trying to compete for. Jim Prentice was trying to win every single seat in Alberta. He thought he could win downtown Edmonton pretty much. And they ended up winning very, very little, whereas Wild Rose said, wow, you know, we've just been through hell. So we're going to win. We're going to try and win rural, south, central, and maybe some in the north. And if we're really lucky, one or two in Calgary. And they got them. Actually, Wild Rose won all of its target seats and then a few more. So that's the problem with voter efficiency. Out of the regional breakdowns, what stands out to you, Cory? Is it Ontario, the slim margin the Conservatives got, or is it BC that they're actually a pretty big lead now?
Well, yeah, it's. I mean, BC's always been a hornet's nest. If you want a tough area to predict, look at Vancouver. You can have an NDP seat next to a very conservative seat next to a Green seat.
They used to have next to Reform seats.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's where positive campaigning will really make a difference. I mean, you got those needles to move. Same with those areas in Ontario with those micro thin margins. But right now, what we're seeing, I guess, is anybody's guess. I mean, it's a close race, though. I mean, this is the first time we could kind of say that in a while, too. I mean, it's been pretty safely liberal for quite a while with all the polls you see. And right now, there is definitely some room for some movement and shifting if the votes go the right way in our crazy system.
Very, very interesting. And we'll wrap up with this. Is the leading province for now, this is margin of errors. We're talking in single points, 2 points at this point. So the accuracy goes down. But the strongest province for the PPC is Ontario, where those margins are so thin. Second is Alberta, where the margins are so not thin. But 6% in Ontario, that is a lot of votes up for grabs. Now, and I don't think there's any big deal to be had. I don't think Maxime Bernier has any desire to work for anybody else. And I don't think Poilievre, even though Poilievre probably ideologically agrees with Bernier in a lot, I can't imagine him having to essentially share the leadership. There's just no way he would agree to it. These guys are not going to end up in the same party in the next election. But if Poilievre can find a way to bring those voters home, so to speak, that would move Ontario then decisively in his direction. And that is the election right there. You could win the next majority government with that 6% sitting for the PPC in Ontario. That, if I'm advising Poilievre, I'd say that is the group you got to get while alienating as few swing Liberal and NDP voters as possible. You get them, the election's over. Okay. Well, very numbery conversation today, guys. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
All right. Well, I thank all of you for joining us today. We appreciate you giving us your time this evening. If you're not yet a member of the Western Standard, go to westernstandard.news, click on membership. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year to support independent, bailout-free Western journalism. Thank you very much for your time, and God bless. Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99